"I'm sorry, sir. This meal isn't for you." The words didn't echo, they cut, clean and deliberate, slicing through the soft hum of engines and polite first-class chatter at 36,000 feet above Kansas. Every fork paused mid-air. Every quiet conversation dimmed just enough to listen without looking like they were listening. Malik Carter didn't move. Not at first. Seated in 2A, dressed in a plain black hoodie and dark jeans, he looked like someone who had been upgraded by luck, not someone who belonged. That was the assumption. That was always the assumption. The flight attendant, Claire Whitmore, stood beside him, posture perfect, smile thin, her hand already pulling the white linen tray back an inch as if correcting a mistake the moment it appeared. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored navy suit accepted his identical meal with a nod and a thank you. No questions asked, no hesitation offered. Malik's eyes followed that tray for half a second, then returned forward, calm, unreadable, like a man watching something unfold exactly as expected. The cabin lights were dimmed to a soft amber, casting long reflections across polished surfaces, turning every glance into something sharper, more noticeable. A woman 3 rows back shifted in her seat. Someone near the window adjusted their phone angle just slightly. No one spoke, but everyone felt it, the imbalance subtle but unmistakable, like pressure building before a storm. Claire cleared her throat softly, leaning in just enough to keep her voice controlled but audible. "This service is reserved for verified first-class passengers," she added, her tone wrapped in policy but edged with something colder, something practiced. Malik exhaled once through his nose. Slow. Measured. Not offended. Not surprised. Just present. His hands rested loosely on the armrests, fingers still, as if even movement required intention. He turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes, not confrontational, not submissive, just steady. And in that stillness something shifted. Not in her. Not yet. But in the room. Because there was no confusion in his expression. No scrambling. No embarrassment. Just a quiet awareness, like he was taking inventory not of the situation but of the people. The responses. The choices. Across the aisle, the man in the navy suit avoided eye contact now, focusing too hard on his plate. 2 rows back, a younger flight attendant lingered near the galley, her brow tightening just slightly as she watched the exchange stretch longer than it should have. Malik's gaze drifted once across the cabin, faces, reactions, silence, then returned forward again. "Understood," he said finally, voice low, even carrying just enough weight to land without force. No argument. No defense. Just acknowledgement. And somehow that made it heavier. Because this wasn't a man trying to prove he belonged. This was a man letting them prove he didn't. Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second, so brief it could have been missed, but it was there. Then she pulled the tray away completely, turning on her heel with the efficiency of someone convinced she'd handled the situation correctly. The aisle cleared. The moment should have ended. But it didn't. Because Malik didn't look down at his empty tray table. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't signal for water. He just sat there, still as the aircraft itself, eyes forward, as if the real event hadn't happened yet. And in a way it hadn't. Because what no one in that cabin understood, not Claire, not the passengers, not even the crew preparing the next round of service, was that this wasn't about a meal. It never was. This was about a pattern. A test. And Malik Carter had just seen everything he needed to see. The tray never came back, and that absence lingered longer than the service itself, stretching across the cabin like a quiet line no one dared to cross. Malik Carter remained still, not out of resignation but control, the kind that did not need to announce itself, the kind that watched and waited, cataloging every movement, every glance, every decision made in that narrow aisle at 36,000 feet. The engines hummed with mechanical certainty, but the air inside the cabin felt different. Now charged, aware, as if something subtle had shifted beneath the polished surface of premium service. A man 2 seats ahead leaned slightly toward his companion and whispered something too low to catch, but his eyes flicked back once, then quickly forward again, careful not to be seen looking too long. Malik noticed. He noticed everything. The way Claire avoided passing his row again, rerouting her path through the galley instead. The way another attendant hesitated before approaching with a beverage cart, pausing just long enough to assess him again as if re-evaluating a decision already made, then moving on without a word. It was not loud, it was not Dramatic, but it was consistent, and consistency told the truth louder than any accusation ever could. Malik shifted slightly in his seat, just enough to reach into the pocket of his hoodie. His phone appeared in his hand, but he did not unlock it right away. His thumb rested against the screen as his gaze drifted once more across the cabin. A quiet sweep, left to right, faces, posture, silence, then back to center. The younger flight attendant near the galley, her name tag read Emily, lingered. Again, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in judgment but in uncertainty. She had seen his boarding pass earlier at the gate. She remembered the green confirmation flash. She remembered the seat number 2A. She remembered because she had double-checked it herself when the scanner paused for half a second longer than usual. Now that memory sat heavier in her chest, pressing against what she was watching unfold. She took a step forward, then stopped, hesitation wrapped around her like a seatbelt. She was not sure she was allowed to unfasten. Malik finally unlocked his phone. The screen lit up his face for a brief moment, calm, focused, unreadable. He scrolled once, not through messages, not through distractions, but through something deliberate, something specific, as if confirming a detail he already knew. Then he lowered it again without typing a single word. Across the aisle, the man in the navy suit cleared his throat softly, uncomfortable now, not because of what had happened, but because of what had not been corrected. The absence of resolution made it worse, made it linger, made it visible. Malik leaned back slightly into his seat, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward, but there was a difference now, a quiet shift in energy like a switch had been flipped internally, not outwardly visible but present, precise, controlled. This was no longer observation, this was preparation. And still he said nothing because silence, when held long enough, stopped being passive, it became a mirror. And in that mirror, everyone in that cabin was starting to see themselves a little more clearly than they expected. The service continued as if nothing had happened, but the rhythm was off, uneven in a way that only careful eyes could detect. Drinks were poured, trays were delivered, polite smiles were exchanged, yet every movement around row 2 carried a subtle hesitation, like a script being followed with one missing line. Claire reappeared from the galley with a fresh set of linens, her posture still composed, but her eyes avoided Malik completely now, choosing instead to focus on the passenger across the aisle, offering him a second drink with a brightness that felt slightly overperformed, as if compensating for something left unresolved. Malik did not turn his head, but he noticed the extra attention, the careful redirection, the quiet effort to pretend the earlier moment had not defined the space between them. A man seated behind Malik shifted forward and spoke just loud enough to be heard without making it obvious. "Excuse me, I think he was supposed to get that meal too." His voice was cautious, not confrontational, but it broke the pattern even slightly. Claire paused mid-motion, her hand hovering over a glass before setting it down with precise control. "Sir, all services are allocated according to passenger verification," she replied, her tone smooth, rehearsed, final. The man leaned back slowly, unsure whether to push further. The answer had not been loud, but it had been firm enough to close the door. Malik's expression did not change, but something behind. His eyes sharpened, not anger, not frustration, something colder, something more deliberate. Across the cabin, Emily took another step forward, this time not stopping halfway. She approached Claire quietly near the galley, her voice low but urgent. "I checked his boarding pass. Earlier it scanned green, seat 2A. Claire's smile did not disappear, but it tightened at the edges. "Then the system must have updated." "Emily, let it go," she whispered back, her tone controlled but edged with warning. Emily hesitated, her gaze flicking once toward Malik, then back to Claire. Uncertainty pressed against her again, but now it was heavier, harder to ignore, because what she had seen did not match what she was hearing. And that gap was growing wider with every passing second. Malik shifted slightly, reaching for the small bottle of water placed on his tray earlier, unopened. He twisted the cap slowly, deliberately. The soft click of the seal breaking sounded louder than it should have in the quiet tension of the cabin. He took a sip, calm, unhurried, then set it back down with the same measured control. Across the aisle, the man in the navy suit finally spoke, his voice low but clear enough. "If there is a mistake, it should be corrected," he said, not looking directly at Claire this time, but not avoiding her either. It was not support, not fully, but it was not silence anymore, and silence had been the foundation holding this moment together. Claire straightened slightly, her composure returning in full force. "There is no mistake, sir," she replied, each word placed carefully like a line drawn in the air. But the line was no longer invisible, it was visible now, to more than just Malik, to more than just Emily, to the entire cabin that had been quietly watching and now could not unsee what had already unfolded. Malik leaned back again, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged, but the atmosphere around him had shifted completely. This was no longer a quiet oversight. It was a pattern being defended in real time, and the more it was defended, the clearer it became. Malik's fingers brushed lightly against his phone again, not yet lifting it, not yet acting, but closer now, because the room had reached a point where observation alone was no longer enough. The pattern had revealed itself fully, and once a pattern revealed itself, it could not be ignored, not by him, not anymore. The moment lingered in the air, thick and taut, like an invisible thread pulled tight enough to snap. Malik remained still, his attention shifted ever so slightly toward the small screen of his phone. His fingers tapped lightly against the surface, not hurriedly, but with quiet precision, as if entering a series of motions that needed to be timed perfectly. He lifted the phone just enough for the glow to reflect on his face. No one around him could hear what he was typing, but the quiet tension in the cabin seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something more. Claire, still standing near the galley, glanced over her shoulder once more, catching his stillness, his control. The hesitation was brief but unmistakable. There was something more happening here. Something neither her training nor her instinct had prepared her for. She forced a smile, turning back toward the aisle, trying to pull the attention back to the routine, but the eyes of the passengers had shifted. All of them were watching subtly like pieces on a chessboard. The silent understanding that something wasn't right, that something wasn't going according to plan, spread quickly among them. Malik's fingers paused. The screen of his phone illuminated his face just for a moment longer. Then he slid it back into his pocket with a deliberate slowness that carried a weight. Without looking at anyone, he finally spoke, his voice low and calm, but carrying across the cabin with a quiet force. "This is how it always goes, isn't it?" His words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They were simple, direct, almost like an invitation for the room to finally hear the truth they had been avoiding. Claire's smile faltered just slightly, the mask of professionalism slipping for an instant. She looked at him, but the words she wanted to say were trapped somewhere between a refusal to engage and the truth she wasn't ready to admit. "Sir, if you're suggesting something," she began, but Malik's voice cut through her before she could finish. "You called me a fraud," he said, his words holding no anger, only fact. "In a company I own." His gaze met hers for the first time, unflinching, as though the weight of his words alone could force an acknowledgement. For a second, the entire cabin held its breath. Even the man in the navy suit, who had been quietly trying to disengage, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His gaze dropped to the floor. The room was no longer just an in-flight space. It was a courtroom, and every seat in that cabin was a jury. Claire opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. There was no more rehearsed explanation, no more deflection. The words that had been so easy to say moments before were suddenly irrelevant. They didn't matter anymore. Malik's steady gaze never wavered. He had known exactly how this moment would unfold from the start, and now, as the power in the room began to shift, he allowed the silence to settle, heavy and unyielding. The realization that the man who had been dismissed, who had been treated as less than, was not just any passenger, but someone who held the reins of the very company they worked for, sank in. The truth, once revealed, spread like wildfire. The passengers who had been quietly observing began to murmur, their voices soft at first but growing with each passing second. Malik remained silent, allowing the wave of understanding to wash over the cabin. It was happening now, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Claire's expression tightened as she realized the magnitude of what had just been said. But it was too late for words. The damage had already been done. And Malik knew that this was no longer just about a meal, no longer just about a seat. It was about respect. It was about power. And the moment that had been a test of patience had now become a test of truth. The murmur in the cabin slowly grew louder, whispers weaving through the rows, fragments of disbelief and realization. Malik sat still, his expression unchanged, though his presence now seemed even more commanding, more defined. The passengers, once quiet observers, were now part of something larger than themselves. They could feel the shift, the crack in the air, the undeniable realization that the man who had been dismissed moments ago wasn't just anyone. His calmness, his certainty spoke volumes in a way that no confrontation ever could. Claire, her smile now gone, hesitated before she spoke, her voice cracking slightly under the weight of the moment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," she began, but Malik interrupted her before she could finish, his tone measured, deliberate. "It's not about what you meant," he said softly, but each word hit with the clarity of truth. "It's about how you treated me when you thought I didn't belong." The words hung in the air, and the entire cabin seemed to inhale collectively. It wasn't just an apology he was offering her. It was the opportunity to acknowledge the reality of the situation, to face what had been done, and to understand the power dynamics at play. Malik leaned back slightly in his seat, his eyes scanning the room once more. This time the silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was charged with an unspoken understanding. The passengers around him, the crew, even those who had been silent observers, were beginning to process what had just unfolded. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others exchanged looks, and a few, like the man in the navy suit, no longer tried to hide the guilt creeping across their faces. Claire shifted, her composure slipping once more as the weight of Malik's words continued to settle over the cabin. She cleared her throat, taking a step back, unsure of how to regain control. But the control had already shifted. The balance of power had irrevocably tilted, and nothing in this moment could reverse it. Malik's gaze remained steady, unyielding, and the passengers who had been quietly watching began to see the unfolding truth. That what had just transpired was more than just a minor inconvenience, more than a mistake. It was a moment of clarity, a stark realization of the biases that lived beneath the surface of everyday interactions, especially in spaces meant to serve the elite. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional soft rustle of a passenger adjusting in their seat, the sound of a bag shifting, the quiet click of a phone being set aside. No one dared to speak, not yet. The tension in the air was palpable, but so was the respect. And in that silence, in that stillness, the truth had already been acknowledged. Malik sat, poised and calm, like a man who had faced this many times before, but who had reached a point where no more concessions were to be made. He had not needed to raise his voice. He had not needed to demand anything. The truth in its simplest form had been enough. He could feel it now, the shift in the atmosphere, the understanding among the passengers that this was not just a story about a meal or a seat. This was about recognition, about respect, about power in its quietest, most undeniable form. The quiet that filled the cabin stretched longer than anyone expected, but it was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that demanded attention. Malik's gaze remained fixed, his posture relaxed but unwavering, as if he had always known this moment would arrive, though perhaps not in this exact way. Around him the passengers shifted, their glances darting between him and the crew, unsure of what was supposed to happen next, but all of them feeling the undeniable change in the air. Claire, still standing by the galley, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, took one last look around the cabin. It was a fleeting glance, but it said more than words could have in that moment. She was aware of the eyes on her now, the murmurs rising from the passengers, each one piecing together the same reality. It was no longer a question of whether Malik belonged here. It was a question of how they had failed to see it. The tension in the air thickened, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though no one would break the stillness. But then the captain's voice echoed through the intercom, smooth and practiced, but laced with something softer than the usual tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching our cruising altitude. Please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened until we reach our final destination. Thank you for your cooperation." It was a professional announcement, yet it felt somehow out of place, as if the world outside the cabin had continued while the room inside had come to a complete standstill. But even the captain's voice couldn't erase the truth that had been spoken aloud. The passengers, still trying to digest what had just happened, found themselves at a crossroads. No one could pretend they hadn't heard the shift in power, the quiet realization that Malik was not just any passenger. He was the one who held the keys to the very system they were all caught in. Malik reached for his phone again, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he had already made his decision about what to do next. His fingers hovered over the screen, pausing just long enough for the room to feel the suspense, the uncertainty that lingered after a moment of clarity. He didn't need to speak. His actions were enough. He tapped the screen once, his expression unchanged as he began to type. In the quiet that followed, it was clear that he wasn't doing this for anyone's approval. He was doing this because it was the only thing left to do. It wasn't about the meal. It wasn't about the seat. It was about what came next, the responsibility that came with owning the space, owning the truth, and demanding respect in a way that couldn't be ignored. As he typed, the cabin fell into a deeper silence, not because they had to be quiet, but because they knew they had already seen something they couldn't unsee. The system they thought they understood, the one that had operated under an unspoken set of rules, was no longer as it seemed. And as Malik continued to type, his fingers moved with the certainty of someone who knew that the next few moments would unfold in a way no one could predict, but in a way that would never go back to what it had been. In the background, the soft hum of the aircraft seemed to fade, drowned out by the weight of the moment. And then when he finished, Malik set the phone down, his gaze sweeping across the cabin once more, his presence unshaken, as though the room itself had shifted to meet him where he stood. It was a quiet power, the kind that could silence a room without a word being spoken. And for the first time it was clear that it was not just his presence that held the room, it was the truth he had brought with him. The hum of the airplane engines filled the silence, but it no longer felt like the sound of just an aircraft in motion. It had transformed into a background, a steady rhythm that marked the passing of time as the reality inside the cabin continued to shift. Malik's phone lay quietly on the tray in front of him. Its screen dimmed, but the weight of what had just transpired still hung in the air, thick and unshakable. The cabin was no longer just a place of travel. It had become a space of reckoning, of truth. The passengers were beginning to understand this, each one of them slowly grasping the quiet significance of the moment, as if the world outside could wait while this one brief instance played out. Claire, who had once commanded the room with a practiced air of authority, now stood on the edge of it, unsure of how to regain control. She glanced at the other crew members, but no one moved. No one knew what to do next. The weight of Malik's words had settled deep into the fabric of the flight, like a shadow that refused to leave. His calmness had done more than just silence the room. It had challenged the very system that they operated within. It was clear now that this wasn't just about the meal, the seat, or the usual protocols. It was about the power dynamics, the invisible boundaries that existed beneath the surface, and Malik had not just crossed them. He had illuminated them for everyone to see. As the minutes passed, the passengers exchanged glances, some uneasy, others more aware than before. A few even seemed to acknowledge the shift, the unspoken realization that the balance they once took for granted had been irrevocably altered. Claire took a step forward, her voice trembling slightly as she finally spoke, though the words came with a certain reluctance. "Is there anything I can do to make this right?" she asked, her gaze now meeting Malik's for the first time since the tension had begun. Malik looked at her, his expression still composed, but there was a quiet force behind his gaze that spoke volumes. "It's not about making it right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about recognizing what's been wrong all along." The room went still again, as if the words themselves held more weight than any action could. Claire opened her mouth to respond but stopped herself, as if the realization had dawned upon her in that very moment. The system she had been a part of, the one she had always followed, was flawed. It had allowed moments like this to happen, moments where people were overlooked, dismissed, treated as less than because of something as arbitrary as appearance. And in that silence, it became clear that Malik was not just the passenger being treated unfairly. He was the catalyst, the one who had made the truth visible, the one who had made the invisible visible, the one who had forced everyone in that cabin to confront their own complicity, whether they realized it or not. Malik leaned back slightly in his seat, his fingers tapping once on the side of the tray table, still calm, still unhurried. The tension in the room didn't dissipate, but it transformed. No longer was it just an uncomfortable silence. Now it felt like a shared awareness, a collective understanding that could not be ignored. And as the flight continued its course, the passengers sat in that awareness, some shifting uncomfortably, others lost in thought, all of them waiting for the next moment, for the next decision, for the next step in the unfolding journey. But Malik had already decided. He had already made his point, and in the stillness that followed, the truth had already begun to do its work. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity, yet they passed by quickly. a strange paradox hanging in the air. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Where tension once filled the cabin like a thick fog, now there was a quieter, more uncomfortable stillness, but it was different. The kind of stillness that comes when the truth is no longer hidden, and the weight of that truth is something no one can avoid. Malik remained where he was, seated comfortably in his spot, but his presence seemed to stretch beyond the physical space he occupied. He was no longer just a passenger. He had become something else in the eyes of those around him. The man in the navy suit, who had earlier been hesitant, now appeared more unsettled. He was the first to break the silence, his voice low and unsure, but loud enough for those around him to hear. I didn't mean to make this worse, he said, his words faltering as he glanced at Malik, then quickly looked away, as if trying to retract his previous stance. Malik's gaze flicked toward him, and for a moment, the cabin felt like it was holding its breath again, waiting for him to speak. "It's not about making it worse," Malik said, his tone still steady, but his words cutting through the lingering discomfort. "It's about understanding that it's already been worse for a long time." The man shifted in his seat, uncomfortable now, not from the words themselves, but from the realization that he was part of something larger than just a simple flight. He was part of the system that allowed such moments to occur. The silence returned, but it was not the same as before. It wasn't filled with the uncertainty of what had just happened. It was filled with the understanding of what had been revealed. People had begun to see the cracks in the system they were operating in, and those cracks couldn't be ignored anymore. Claire, still standing by the galley, swallowed hard, her posture shifting slightly as if she was beginning to realize that what had happened wasn't just about a mistake that needed to be corrected. This was about an underlying issue that no one had addressed before. This was bigger than her, bigger than the crew, bigger than the company they worked for. And in that realization, she too felt the weight of what Malik had exposed. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as Malik sat there, unhurried, calm, still. He wasn't waiting for an apology. He wasn't waiting for anything. He had already made his point. The only thing left to do now was for the others to decide how they would respond, how they would move forward in a world where the truth had been exposed so plainly. And yet, even in the quiet that followed, there was no sense of resolution. There were no grand gestures, no speeches, no declarations of justice, just a quiet understanding that things had changed. The balance of power, once hidden behind facades and assumptions, had been shifted. Malik had done nothing but sit and speak the truth. And in doing so, he had made the invisible visible. The rest of the cabin, the rest of the passengers and the crew stood in the aftermath of that moment, uncertain of where to go next, but knowing that they couldn't go back to the way things were. The flight continued, but it no longer felt like just another journey. Felt like something more. Something that had been quietly, subtly, irrevocably altered. As the flight continued on its course, the hum of the engines became a distant backdrop to the stillness that had taken root in the cabin. Malik remained seated, unmoved, as the rest of the passengers and crew navigated the ripple he had caused. No one spoke directly to him anymore, but the air was thick with the weight of his presence. The usual banter, the quiet murmurs that once filled the cabin, had given way to something different. The passengers who had once been oblivious to the quiet biases that had been revealed now sat with a new awareness. Some kept their eyes forward, pretending to return to their routine, while others glanced occasionally at Malik, as if unsure whether they should acknowledge what had just transpired. The man in the navy suit, the one who had tried to speak earlier, sat back in his seat, his gaze fixed on the seat in front of him, lost in thought. He had seen Malik's actions, and though no words had passed between them, the message was clear: things had changed. Even Claire, who had tried to regain control earlier, now stood quietly in the galley, her hands clasped in front of her as she gazed out of the small window. Her role had always been defined by rules, by structure, by a system that told her how to act, what to do, and how to manage any situation. But the rules had shifted, and for the first time, Claire wasn't sure where she stood. Malik's calmness, his quiet authority, had unraveled something in the fabric of the flight, something no one had expected to be revealed. And now it was clear that no matter how much they tried to return to normal, the damage had been done. What had been left unsaid, what had been buried under layers of protocol and procedure, had come to light, and now it could not be ignored. The flight continued, the miles between them and their destination slowly ticking down, but inside the cabin, the real journey had only just begun. Malik, still seated, was not the same man who had boarded the flight. He had known the moment would come, though he had not predicted the exact form it would take. What had started as a routine flight had transformed into something deeper, something more profound. He had not sought confrontation. He had not demanded attention. All he had done was expose the truth, and in doing so he had forced everyone around him to confront it. The passengers, the crew, even the man in the navy suit, none of them could look at the situation the same way again. And while Malik remained silent, his presence alone spoke louder than any words could. This was not just about a seat or a meal. This was about the power to change the narrative, to shift the dynamics, and to make people see things for what they truly were. The flight